One of the big challenges on the educational side is how do we create a 21st century workforce that is science fluent and change maker skills smart?
No debate de hoje, a gente vai ter o prazer de contar com o Bill Carter, uma das pessoas que ajudou a fundar a Ashoka, a maior organização de empreendedores sociais do mundo. E quem vai me ajudar a entrevistar o Bill hoje é o Guilherme Rosso, presidente da Emerge, né, que é uma nova organização também trabalhando em empreendedorismo social, mas uma fronteira nova, que é Ciência. I'd like to start these conversations learning more about your history, how you become who you are. If you could, I know that you lived a little bit in Indonesia,
yes.
You can even speak Indonesia. If you could share with us, it would be a pleasure.
Well, I was born and raised in Hawaii.
Okay.
So I grew up in a multicultural environment without even realizing it. And when that really left a very strong impression on me. And so when I was trying to figure out what I should do in my life, particularly after university, I moved to Indonesia and I started exploring how can local populations take control of their resources. And so I immediately found myself embroiled in a very interesting development challenge that was taking place for indigenous people in the outer islands of Indonesia that involved business and the citizen sector and government. So I learned a lot as a young person about that, and that I sort of carried that interest forward in later parts of my professional life. I did similar types of work in Jordan, and then in the U.S. Working in areas like public housing. And then I met Bill Drayton, who had the idea for creating the field of social entrepreneurship, and I said, "That's it. That I really want to do that." And so he and I had worked together, and he invited me to join him to help start the organization, and I did, and we piloted the idea in Indonesia and in India, and so I've been a part of Ashoka in various ways ever since 1980 when it was founded. First as a member of the board for many years, and then I asked if I could step down from the board and join the staff, and so for the last 10 years I've worked a lot in Africa with our team in Africa, and then I spotted this I started seeing a lot of scientists showing up in our fellow selection process.
Wow.
And all over the world, because that was one of my jobs, running around the world interviewing fellows. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. When Ashoka sees a pattern, it means something is up in the world. And so I asked Ashoka if I could pursue that idea, and we pulled a team together to work on that idea, that's a short way of describing where I began and how I happen to be here today.
What did you study at the university?
At university I was really interested in how societies dealt with conflict.
Okay.
That was, and I became interested in it sort of globally, both Europe and then in Asia, in Africa, and then in my graduate work I really focused in on issues like corruption, economic development, the plight of indigenous people, and so I really it was sort of the intersection of the environment, economic development, and social issues that's where I wound up. It was kind of a bit of a journey, but those are kind of the three issues that I keep being drawn back to.
Well, I'd like to learn about Guilherme's history as well, because I think there are some similarities.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here with you, Bill, and with you, Leandro. I was born in the extreme northern region of Brazil, in a state called Roraima, in the capital Boa Vista. But then I moved to the northeast. My father, he worked in the army, and that's why I moved a lot, not around the world, but around Brazil. And my mom is from the south, so I have this mixture or this cultural mix in my family background. But then I became interested in science and physics and math So during my undergrad, I applied for my university, Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte, to study science and technology. And then in 2012, I was part of the first group of the Brazil Science Without Borders program, which was a huge program that has sent over 100,000 students and Brazilian researchers abroad. I was one of them. And then when we came back, I was one of the founders with some colleagues of the Rede CSF, which is the SWB alumni network. So I became involved a lot with science, and I met a lot of scientists. I did my master's here at the University of São Paulo studying science and technology policy. And then with some friends as well, one of them is a fellow of Ashoka. His name is Rodrigo Brito. So we founded Emerge, which is a NGO that supports entrepreneurial scientists. So we call them sci-entrepreneurs. I know Bill called them sci-preneurs. So it's like tomato and tomato,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
And now, in the last 2 years, we've been developing some programs to build this community around the entrepreneurial scientists, but also to foster science-based businesses. And that's how we believe we are contributing to the solutions of the global challenges.
Great. I know that you have some questions for Bill. You are really looking forward to this opportunity. Now it's the time.
Okay, so I have a question for you. It's between the intersection of social entrepreneurship and science. So in the past years, we could see a movement, a strong movement in social entrepreneurship and science, but in separate manner.
Yeah.
And now those two areas are binding together,
Yeah.
bonding,
Yeah.
and we are expecting to see a great result. So what is your perspective about science and social entrepreneurship being together, and what are the possible outcomes of it?
Sure. No, thank you. That's a great question. From my perspective, the forces that I've seen that have produced the movement that your life illustrated, your life, your experience, your education, your commitment, your passion for science. When I look back at it historically, there seems to be two things that are particularly striking to me. One is that science has converged. That you were talking about, there are all the different things you were studying at the same time. I mean, that larger historical process of all the science disciplines, basically the boundaries between the different disciplines disappearing, and a lot of that being driven by technology, and big data and a lot of the other things. That's one thing. The other thing is that at the same time that was going on, you had a huge complement of over 3,000 scientists all working toward a consensus on because the world's fundamental systems, the biological systems, the physics, the oceans, the weather, everything was changing. But nobody knew quite why. Was the world going to get hotter, darker? And there was this huge debate, right, that was going on. And then the scientists reached a consensus on that. And so suddenly for Ashoka fellows of all kinds, the rules were all different. The rules now today are all different. And science is sort of reset the table, the social table. And so I think that we're at a stage where social entrepreneurs can't work without scientists, and scientists now, because they've entered the public square, they've had to fight to defend their opinions. They've been attacked for even suggesting that any of these changes will take place. I mean, so politically they've had to take their knocks in the public. And so there's now a generation, like you and Rodrigo, who've basically realized that this is a struggle, right? It's a struggle. Things have to be sustainable. They have to have a business model behind them. But at the same time, the stakes are so high, right? Now, the stakes are just the stakes couldn't be higher for the future of the world and for all living things. And so I think that I think this is the moment, right, when science and the scientists become more socially entrepreneurial, and citizen sector change makers have to become much more science fluent. There's just in the old days, in 1980 or in the early 80s in Brazil, we were saying the citizen sector has to become more entrepreneurial and the business sector has to become more socially focused. Today, that bridge there's still the bridge to be built, but now it's to the citizen sector and the business people who've kind of met in the middle, and the science and then the science profession, which is just now, I think, stepping into that space. So I think that's the opportunity, and it's as historic an opportunity as the opportunity was to create social entrepreneurship. Yeah.
I have a question. It's for a lot of people, it's brand new to heard about scientists that are at the same time social entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
I like to make a step back.
Yeah.
And to have a view, an explanation. What is a social entrepreneur, and what kind of people Ashoka is looking for when you want to nominate someone as a Ashoka Fellow? Because I think that you need to explain this to show how new is to be a scientist that is at the same time a social entrepreneur.
What Ashoka sought to do, Ashoka's task in 1980 was how to create the field of social entrepreneurship. And what our strategy was to try to define the apex of that profession. Who are the very best social entrepreneurs going to be? Could you select them? Did they exist in all systems? These are all open questions in 1980. Did they exist everywhere? Was there some kind of cultural bias in this kind of an idea? Could you actually go anywhere and find these people? Did they work in all fields? And so what we were trying to do was our case was, this is global, social entrepreneurs, system changing social entrepreneurs. You can find them anywhere in the world. You can find them any field in the world. This was you can't believe how out of the mainstream that idea was. And that we were going to trust these people with their ideas for changing their societies, and we weren't going to put all of our faith in the World Bank or some other big international development agency or some economist. So I mean, you take Maria Allegretti, right? I mean, the rubber tappers movement in Brazil, right? System-changing new idea, right? Who was going to conserve those resources? Well, the people who were living there were going to conserve those resources, and how are they going to do it? So she became an Ashoka Fellow, as did the founder before her of that movement, who unfortunately was killed in his work. But she inherited that movement, and she built it into. And it was one of those. It was an idea about how do you protect the rainforest, and who are we going to trust to do that, and how are we going to empower those people to do that, and what was the government's role going to be in that, and what was the role for businesses, and how should the farmers treat them? And it was resetting the relationships among all those different people, and it was people like Maria Allegretti who had to basically figure out how to maneuver around all the competing interests and establish that idea as the new standard. So she had a system-changing new idea. She was very creative about the details of how she did it, and then how she built that movement to make too strong. She was entrepreneurial in the sense that she was completely committed to that idea. That was going to be her scratch on history. So when Ashoka talks about entrepreneurial quality, we're looking at the full-time commitment of that person to that idea to take it to its logical conclusion for as long as it takes. The idea had a lot of social impact, and the ethical fiber was perfect. Those are Ashoka's 5 selection criteria, and she's an example of one of almost 400 Brazilian Ashoka Fellows who embody that spirit.
And what kind of a position, you mentioned that in the 80s, this whole idea of social entrepreneur was a little bit controversial, because I can't even imagine, I don't know, probably in the left, a lot of people were talking about, you need to create leaders, or a different set of words. In the right, probably some people say, well, social entrepreneurs. What kind of oppositions in the helm of ideas did you have to face when you proposed this idea of social entrepreneurs?
Well, because at that point when we were starting, we hadn't found Maria Allegretti yet. And so people said to us, well, there aren't any people like that. And we said, well, what about Florence Nightingale? And they said, you mean the lady who helped save all those British soldiers in the Crimea? We said, no, you're wrong. That is a popular misconception of Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale created the modern medical profession. She changed the way hospitals worked. The fact that you could even get hot food even have food cooked in a hospital and have it served to a patient on a different floor. She even designed the dumbwaiters that moved the food up and down. She created the modern nursing profession. She changed the relationships between the doctors and nurses. She introduced hygiene. She designed the hospitals, just the way they were laid out. Every single element of that industry had in its modern manifestation what came out of the mind of Florence Nightingale. The only thing she was given credit for was being a heroic nurse and leading a group of heroic nurses and maybe creating the modern nursing profession, maybe. But when economists have stepped back and said, Florence Nightingale, who created more economic capital, economic and social capital in the world, Florence Nightingale or the big American industrialist Andrew Carnegie? And the answer was Florence Nightingale. But so that part of what we had to do was we had to basically help people understand their history more accurately and say, no, they are out there now, you just you're not seeing them. They're there, but the way in which we look at these people and evaluate them, we don't see them for who they really are. So the argument we had to make before we had fellows was to make the historical argument that they actually existed and they existed all over the world, which was also something that people said, oh no, you'll never find them in Indonesia. I had been working with them in Indonesia. I said, please, this is not true. But that's why the early years we spent in our pilots in India and Indonesia. And it was really only once we'd been able to show people that they were there and that they were there. India and Indonesia are two very different cultures. So not at all the same. We said, look, two different cultures. Yes, they're both in Asia, but two very different cultures. Do we have social? Yes, we have fellows. And that was the point at which the Brazilians got really in. I mean, it was at that point that they had watched us, right? There were Brazilian philanthropists and investors and people who were dedicated to the citizen sector in Brazil who watched that. And then they literally walked in the door and said, we want this and we want this for Latin America. And that was when we broke out. We broke out of our pilots in India and Indonesia and were able to basically begin to take Ashoka to a global level. But it was thanks to the Brazilians that we were able to really launch ourselves.
In which moment, Guilherme, did you realize you were a social entrepreneur, or that's your destiny in life?
I'm going to answer this and also ask a question to Bill again. But I first became a scientist. So I did research in my undergrads. I went to the United States and I did research in the physics department studying complex matter and nonlinear physics. Then I went to my master's to study science and technology policy. But I think my third sector involvement or social entrepreneurship involvement started when I came back with my 100,000 fellows from Science Without Borders to Brazil. And then we looked at the investment we have received. So in 1 year, I was 18 at the time, I received $59,000 to study abroad from the Brazilian government. And then we asked ourselves, what are we going to do with the investment we received and how are we going to return this investment to society? So that's why we created and founded the Alumni Network. And now at the Merge, I am not doing research per se. I'm not a scientist in the lab, but I'm fostering the community. I am providing the proper stimuli, the proper stimulus for the scientists to become entrepreneurs and to open companies and to do science that matters and science that can change the world and change at the systemic level, as Bill said. And my question about this is, nowadays we have so from all the scientists that have lived in the entire human history, 90% of them are alive today.
Yes.
And all of them know how to do science. But most of them don't know how to open companies
Yes.
and or to run businesses. And when we talk about entrepreneurship in science, we are talking about open companies from the research that's being made at the laboratory. And it's a struggle because when we talk about entrepreneurship in science, the death valley of innovation, it's different than usual businesses because the maturation time is longer. So a member of our scientific advisory board, he's a physicist, and in his PhD he studied photomedicine at the University of São Paulo and also at Harvard School, and he has developed this light aid. It's almost a Band-Aid, but using light. So instead of using chemistry, as in the medicine you take to cure your pain, you use light to cure pain. And he's 35. And he's been running this company for the past 4 years, after 4 years of PhD, 2 years of master's, 4 years of physics studies, and now he's going to the market. It's a longer period. Also, the technological risk is much higher. The amount of investment needs for scientific development is also higher because you need infrastructure, complex infrastructure. You need time. You need you need personnel that are PhDs, postdocs, and etc. So, what can scientists learn from social entrepreneurs, and what can social entrepreneurs learn from scientists? And what is the main characteristics for social science entrepreneur?
Right. Sure.
I don't know if I made my point.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
No. I think you made it extremely well. The part of it, I think, is I think what social entrepreneurs know how to do is to do things on the cheap, do things as inexpensively as possible, right? Because they start in they're very resource constrained, and so that's one thing. The second piece of this, which is the question of access to capital, right? And you described this very accurately, right? So the standard venture capital model that people are really familiar with is I've got something and it's ready to go and I need some capital and I can go take it into production now. And with science and with science innovations that they're tied to technology, there's a longer tail to that. It takes longer to get that done. One of the things that we're starting to see is more patient investors, people who are there's starting to be a market of people who are crowding to the table because they want to get a look at things. And so the concept of being an investor in a number of different things that could potentially, like the light aid that you were describing, we're starting to see more people who are, and they're many of the same investors who actually who were the 21st century knowledge industry investor, that in the digital revolution, and they're starting to, I think, change the culture. That's one piece of it. The other part of this is that in order for a society to produce this, you think of what Brazil did, right? It invested in you, and you went abroad, and you came back, and you'd made the connection, right? You were absolutely you had crossed over, and it wasn't looking back, right? And the way you described what you do today is what sci-preneurs do. What we're seeing, and we've elected a number of fellows, Ashoka fellows, in the last 3 or 4 years who basically followed that trajectory and successfully. There are other kinds of sci-preneurship. There are 2 other dimensions to sci-preneurship that are important too, because the piece that we're talking about is the equivalent of kind of it's Ashoka fellows, but maybe business entrepreneurs, or the equivalent on the social side. I could give you examples, but that's not important right now. That's one dimension of sci-preneurship. Definitely. Second dimension of sci-preneurship is, well, how do we create a pipeline of people who don't have to wait for Science Without Borders to go to Europe, who from the 2nd grade on, having their changemaker skills and their exposure to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, along with other things, and then have an opportunity to make changes in their society. So they are super confident by the time they even get out of high school There's a huge market now for what we're seeing in the market of companies. There's a huge market of companies that are looking for young people very young, because the kinds of challenges, the solutions that those young people are coming up with are exactly the ones that they're having. They are at the cutting edge, way ahead of the people who are older than they are, right? It's almost it's like the pyramid reverses, and the young people actually know more than the people who are older than they do, right? So there's that. So the question is, how do we create an educational system that does that? Because as that happens, it's a lot easier for corporations who are facing these challenges internally. How do we keep up with the rate of change to be able to access? So the question is, where's the talent coming from? So one of the big challenges on the educational side is, how do we create a 21st century workforce that is science fluent and change maker skills smart, right? So that you don't have to wait until your 20s or beyond to actually put those pieces together.
Science literacy.
Yes, science literacy. And the third part of it is that there just frankly are parts of the world where those opportunities aren't available. I mean, I spent the better part of a decade in Africa, and the number of science labs in high schools in Africa is just very low, very, very small. Scientists who don't have a chance at a young age to experiment, even if it's just in science, that's really important. And so we have to, part of the workaround here is, how do you develop a science infrastructure for the 21st century that allows those young people the same access to cypreneurship? Because their societies, they have to win this. They have to win this too. They have to win the science and win the change making too, to provide the solutions for their societies. And so part of it is, how do we institutionally create a more level playing field so that the scientists coming out of the Nigerian universities or Ugandan universities have the same experience and have the same and therefore are prepared to wrestle with the same kinds of cypreneurial issues that their societies face. Because right now it's still tilted the other way. I mean, our cypreneurs who are working in the global south have been largely educated in the global north. They're working in the global south, and a lot of the scientific support they're getting is from the global north. Some of the, so there's part of the work we do as Ashoka to try to, in this field of social entrepreneurship, is to try to say, okay, what are the key leverage points where we can try to equalize that playing field, where we can channel resources into these societies that don't have that access to cypreneurship, and what are the quick ways that you can move them quickly up the scale so that they can become as science fluent and change, but in a really substantive way. I mean, and have that kind of deep scientific expertise that you were talking about. So it's a multidimensional issue, and so Ashoka thinks about it in terms of the people, who actually are coming up with these really important solutions to a biodiversity issue or migration or whatever it is. And then we're looking at the structural issues of how you create equality, and then the question is the talent pipeline. How do you make sure that young people all are having an opportunity, just whether they grow up in Dakar or Detroit or, here in Sao Paulo?
I guess the people who are watching us probably are learning a lot about, not only about social entrepreneurship, but also about the edge of the problems you are trying to solve in the world. Well, we're talking about education, and how to improve education. We're talking about, in a systemic level, how to better integrate the global north and the global south, which is a very hot issue today, not only in terms of education resources, but also in terms of immigration.
Yes.
And this, from your question and from your answer comes my next question. That is, most of the people, they more or less know what are the main problems of the world today, probably. The climate is changing, immigration, and poverty. But these are highly debated issues. For example, in your opinion, what are the main issues that you are not debating today, and that you're talking with a lot of people looking for Ashoka fellows, and probably they're looking for a lot of new problems that you are not looking today? Which ones?
You mean in terms of what is the market? How is the market faced with these issues? What's the market asking for?
The new challenges that we are not debating today. You know, that a lot of social leaders, social entrepreneurs are working. I know that a lot of people are working in science.
Right.
I don't know. There are some people working in transportation.
May I give an example?
Issues.
Yeah, sure.
So there are problems that you cannot expect. So in the past years, we all saw the Zika virus problem in the world, and we couldn't expect this.
Yeah.
But I think another perspective or dimension of sci-entrepreneurship or sci-preneurship. So there is this researcher called Celina Turki. She's a Brazilian, and she's a scientist and work in the lab. And she figured that there was a correlation between Zika virus and babies with microcephaly. I don't know if that's the proper word for the disease. And the thing that this discovery, she didn't open a company. She's still a researcher. But this finding allowed the hospitals and the health systems to work towards the prevention of pregnant women, to treat the Zika virus disease and to have precautions. And this became system level change.
And she also discovered there is a correlation between Zika virus
and microcephaly.
Microcephaly, and this has developed a lot of new studies showing how some properties of the Zika virus can, destroy cancer in the brain. Yeah, and there are a lot of new things that are emerging.
Right.
And even, for example, this changes completely the way you look for diseases, for example. Virus, a problem, and probably a new solution coming from this. And this is a thing I'm very curious to know, in which new areas people are working on.
I'll give you two, just to play off the virus. So we have a fellow whose name is Gary Slutkin, and he was an epidemiologist, and he worked in Africa. He worked in camps and one of the things that he figured out was that you could take the learnings for how you basically you control a virus, you control it, then you limit it, and then you stop it. That you could take the same set of tools, same set of insights, and you could apply them to gang violence.
Wow.
And the spread of violence in cities. And he created an organization. He figured out what it was, and then he said, because he was a scientist, he said, this isn't just me thinking about this, let's study this like a scientist would. And so he went into one of the toughest neighborhoods in all of the United States, a place called West Garfield Park in Chicago. I mean, tough area, lots of violence. And what he was able to do was to demonstrate that the methodology worked. And then he took it to different cities all over the world that were plagued by violence. That's sort of it's possible you can take a virus and the learning and then figure out how it could be applied to another medical issue. Yeah. But you could take the practices and you can use them. You can look over here and say, oh, actually, you could take the methodologies, not the microbiology, but you can take the practices and say that would apply here. So that's one example. The example that I've been struck by recently has been, like, for example, recently there have been articles written about research that, and it's a little bit like what she did, that in seeing the relationship between microencephalopathy, I hope so, I got that right, and the Zika virus. But what a mathematician stumbled on was the pattern that they were, the thing that was, plant biologists couldn't figure out why the level of nutrients in plants was going down. And they were trying to experiment with various types of different approaches and what was happening in the biology of the plant. And they just couldn't figure it out. The first time around, couldn't figure it out. There was a mathematician who wasn't a plant biologist, and he was kind of, but he was part of he was part of that group, and he said, oh, it's kind of interesting. And so that project kind of ended, but he just was obsessed with this. He said, well, where's the data fit here? Where is that data fit? between this and something else. And what he stumbled on was that the fit was with levels of carbon in the atmosphere.
Wow.
And then he said, hey, you know, I don't know, but what I'm seeing is the data fit between lowering nutrients and rising carbon levels, and mean atmospheric carbon. The more it goes up, the more the plants and nutrients are going down. And scientists jumped on that. And they just came out with a big study that looked at rice growing in Asia and said, this is absolutely the problem. As carbon levels are going up, they're sending signals to plants, and the plants they're shedding the thing that they're doing in response is to grow bigger. But in the process, it's a trade-off, and a plant has a trade-off in terms of the energy it's got, and so it's dumping its nutrients and it's growing. They're getting bigger, but they're getting less. They have less nutrient value. So now we have an existential challenge, right, for our food supply system, because suddenly we don't have a food supply problem, we have a nutrient supply problem, because every living thing has a nutrient spectrum that it has to have it. If it doesn't, it develops you develop chronic disease, you break down, and ultimately you die. So suddenly we've got, coming out of the work of scientists, a similar kind of correlation that now science is following up. And we had known, Ashoka had been doing some work on this for 10 years. We didn't have the carbon science. But what we did find was that the companies knew that and people were pointing fingers in different ways. Some people say it was genetically modified, and the people who were working in that area say we're not saying it wasn't. We were trying to maximize these plants to protect against pests and various kinds. Because our objective was to grow the maximum amount possible, so we wanted to control for that. We didn't really look at the nutrient questions. But the problem we saw that the nutrient levels were going down where this wasn't. That's a very hot topic of discussion. But when our work with social entrepreneurs, we found they were saying, yeah, but that is not just. It's true, but it doesn't explain the problem completely, right? It is not a necessary It's not the necessary variable. There was some evidence, but it wasn't the answer. And so now, now we know. Now we do know what the core driver. We think we know. We have a very strong hypothesis now, and that's going to completely transform the way we think about biodiversity. And now, and along comes an Ashoka fellow with a solution for that. Not a solution, but a way of approaching that. There's people starting to do that work as well.
It's terrific. In these two examples, you had the power of systemic thinking. People that are looking for a very specific thing, and then they realize that this have a bigger impact in the world. And the second is the power of networks, right?
Yes.
Because probably people, if such people, if they're not connected with other people, probably it's a way harder to have such insights.
Right.
And then we are approaching the end of the interview. I would like to have some advice from you to Brazilian social entrepreneurs. People who are looking to new problems, and that sometimes they feel isolated, experience a lot of hard times here in Brazil right now.
Yes.
What kind of advices would you give to Brazilians who don't feel isolated, or that they can be part of a bigger and systemic transformation in the country right now?
In 2018, there is a network of social entrepreneurs and a growing network of scipreneurs or scientrepreneurs in Brazil, and these people are well known. They're accessible, and there's a growing literature on the work they're doing. There's a growing public and in Brazil. I think in some countries you could say from an absolute perspective there's isolation, where there are other forces that quell the possibility for conversation. But Brazil is a very lively culture of conversation about this, so they shouldn't feel alone in they shouldn't feel isolated in that sense of the word. I think that those communities are accessible. My impression is that Brazil has really led, I mean, the world in so many different ways in terms of creating community for people who have those kinds of interests. To your point, though, I think that it's going to be increasingly important for people who want to work in this space as social entrepreneurs and collaborating with sidepreneurs and sidepreneurs, whatever the combinations, is that they're able to clearly articulate what the value proposition is, be able to present it very clearly as a hypothesis to be tested. I think the language in the field of social entrepreneurship is going to move in that direction now. I can feel it. And be prepared and be fluent enough in the tools of how to analyze the data that comes out of the experiments that they undertake. People think it's pilots, but what that language is. But be prepared. They have to be prepared, I think, to be able to talk about. It's important to be able to adopt both the language of science, but also the language of entrepreneurship. And one of the lessons of entrepreneurship is to fail fast, right? I mean, the danger that scientists find themselves in is it's publish or perish, and then they produce results because they have to do that. They create results that are sometimes not you can't independently verify them, and then at the other end of the process, the whole thing is aimed at sort of creating intellectual property and patents that keeps it out of the commons. So it's this weird old world, right? That and the new world that scientists I think have to prepare themselves for is to work together with other scientists and social entrepreneurs, and work in teams because it's collective intelligence. I think that we clearly know now that the individual social entrepreneur may have a great insight, but boy, if they don't have a team around them of people that are complement them with various science and social disciplines, it's going to be really hard for them to be successful. So I think it's work in teams, look for what your strengths and weaknesses are, think about being able to defend the work you have your evaluation framework in your hands. The way scientists go and say, yeah, here's how we're going to test the data and verify it. Borrowing some of that logic, I think, for everyone working in these fields, is going to be increasingly important. I guess that's kind of the direct in terms of advice I would give to somebody stepping into this work today, whether they were a scientist or not.
Last question, Guilherme?
I have a lot of questions actually, but I cannot pick one specifically. But I agree with Bill that science is a collection of people and a collection of knowledge. And I would say that our shared purpose or our shared value is that we are trying to transform knowledge in impact. And in academia we say, and at Emerge we say, we want to transform papers in GDP and papers in food, when in the case of the nutrients, papers in better health, or papers in quality of life, or papers in more energy distribution. So I believe the purpose of using knowledge, science knowledge or practical knowledge or whatever kind of knowledge anyone has to improve the world we live in, I think that's what we are seeking and looking for it. So if I can make a last question for Bill, what do you think about the Brazilian social sidepreneurs or scientrepreneurs that you have met in the past few weeks here?
I think I think that just like in the early 1980s, the Brazilians are ahead of the game in many respects. Just take the founder, right? Your founder and the work he's done. It's like his. It's not even his. It's his. I can't remember how many different iterations of the work he's done, but he found this issue of sidepreneurship several years ago, and immediately focused in on how do we, realize it was social entrepreneurs, but yeah, it was really a scientist moving into the space that he needed to focus on and create a process and a way of nurturing them to come through. So I mean, in a sense, you're already beginning to build the infrastructure here. And there's and we've had fellows in the past who focused on how do you take a whole city, and like in Bahia, and how does it become a knowledge center, right? How do you take science and technology, and how do you create a community around that? So I think that even in fellowship is usually the kind of the point at which you just begin to start. We're just starting to see people elected to do this kind of work. In Brazil, that's already happening. So I think it's a good sign. And Brazil is possessed of a lively conversation among technology and scientific research institutions and social entrepreneurs. We saw that. We've seen that now for decades. So I think that I think Brazil is on the right track. I think that the thing that we need to do now, and Ashoka's call to action now in terms of Brazil would be, let's elect more. Let's get more cypreneurs in from our perspective, social cypreneurs, but cypreneurs. I mean, cypreneurs coming through some who are coming in from strictly a business model perspective. Cypreneurs, the way Ashoka is thinking about it, where the social, where it is business and social impact, and you can clearly identify what the social impact is, which you can in all these ideas. I think it's a semantic question. Then I think the next thing we need to do is to challenge the education system to step up to this now. And I don't know yet. I know that Ashoka's been doing a lot of really path-breaking work on change-making in education in Brazil. The question is now whether we can fold the science element into that work. I think that's the next step in the process there. But I think the call to action of finding more young people who want to take that up, and more educators who are willing to sort of fuse those curricula so that more young people are more ready at an earlier age with ideas that are testable and provable and economic, and are going to offer, social and economic capital to society. I think that along with just getting more of these people visible, so that you can see them everywhere in every field, anything you can possibly think of. Wow, there is somebody who has figured out how science and social impact fit together in a better way. So people so that you get enough of that. We have enough of them so that the whole society begins to shift in that direction. So right now we have a few, right, and we need more.
It was a pleasure to have you here today. I think that you learned a lot, and you open a lot of new conversations after this conversation. A lot of things you need to change in education. A lot of things you need to change in how we face the problems. And I think that the people who are watching us until now, they're going to have a lot of new ideas to think, a lot of new perspectives to embrace. Hope you enjoyed
thank you.
this conversation.
It was awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was great. It was great speaking with both of you. Thank you so much for this
Likewise.
opportunity. Yeah, it's fun.
Thank you a lot.